Welcome to the deep dive. We cut through the noise to get you to the heart of things. Today, we're looking at a thinker who, well, really doesn't fit neatly into any box, Arthur Schopenhauer. If you want to get your head around some big ideas without drowning in academic speak, well, you're in the right place.
Yeah, Schopenhauer is definitely unique. The first thing this introduction highlights is just how hard he is to classify. Most philosophers kind of build on existing schools. He didn't really do that. He forged his own path. It's quite striking.
Absolutely. I mean, he clearly read the folks who came before him. He wasn't totally isolated, but it seems the crucial thing was how he used those ideas. The intro has this great line. Something like, he borrowed, but the work was assimilated and transmuted as to become his own, bearing his image and superscription.
Exactly. It's like he digested it all and then produced something stamped with his own personality. And that individuality, it wasn't just philosophical ideas, right? It was his style, too. The introduction mentions his very conscious, polished writing, his highly developed artistic sense in picking and arranging things.
Yeah, it wasn't just about getting the point across, it was about the craft, which is kind of funny given his reputation as, a bit of a hermit. But the writing itself is actually quite direct, engaging even. And apparently he took his own advice on writing good titles.
Huh, yeah, catchy titles. Sets the tone. But beyond the style and the unique positioning, it's also key that he wasn't just tearing things down. The intro stresses he had a positive belief he was arguing for. It wasn't all criticism.
Right, he had his own system he was championing. And you feel that conviction, don't you? The intro says it gives this, earnestness even to his harsher moments, his petty moods and savage attacks.
Definitely. He seemed utterly convinced he was right.
Which brings us to maybe the most compelling part, the man himself. His personality. The introduction calls it unique and striking. It pulls you in, even if you don't always, admire him.
Yeah, it suggests understanding him is as complex as understanding his philosophy. They're tangled together.
Deeply intertwined. It uses his own language, saying his character is the will and his philosophy the presentation. Okay, so the philosophy reflects the person, but it wasn't straightforward. The text talks about him being a walking contradiction, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, almost. Two sides fighting.
Pretty much. That internal conflict is painted vividly. And what's really interesting is how he tried to make sense of that himself. The intro mentions him looking at heredity and his whole view of the universe to explain it.
So his cosmic view was him writ large, as the intro puts it, and even specific views like on women reflecting his relationship with his mother.
Yeah, it suggests that connection quite strongly, like his personal dramas were projected onto this grand philosophical stage.
Let's touch on those influences then. Born 1788, died 1860. His father, Heinrich, wealthy merchant, independent thinker, but also maybe some mental struggles, eccentricity, suspiciousness.
That's what the intro implies, yeah. A strong character, but maybe with a darker undercurrent. And then his mother, Johanna. She was literary, graceful, even became a successful writer herself. But apparently not very motherly towards Arthur. The intro paints her as quite vain, self-absorbed. Butterfly vanity is the phrase used.
Ouch. Snubbing him, criticizing him, lacking that warmth. The intro even contrasts it with Kant's mother.
Right, so you have this mix of maybe inherited intensity, a difficult early environment. It must have shaped him profoundly.
Seems likely. Okay, so shifting to intellectual influences, who shaped his actual philosophy?
Well, he clearly had this love for beauty and interest in contemplation. Plato was huge. That whole idea of the perfect, unchanging forms versus the messy world of shadows we see. Plato's cave allegory is mentioned as really central to Schopenhauer's thinking.
The real world versus appearances.
Exactly. And he got into later versions of Platonism and then looked east towards Buddhist ideas, self-obliteration, nirvana, quieting that will to live.
And Kant, the big one in German philosophy then.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Schopenhauer saw himself as Kant's true heir. But this is important. He wasn't just a follower. The intro stresses he was actively translating, selecting, even rejecting parts of Kant to fit his own ideas.
He was quite critical too, wasn't he? Pointing out changes between editions of Kant's big work.
Fiercely critical. Yeah, he called Kant out on modifications. And interestingly, because Schopenhauer wrote so, elegantly compared to maybe Kant or Hegel, some English readers first met Kant and Hegel through Schopenhauer's lens, which wasn't always accurate.
Right, because he thought their style wasn't clear enough.
According to him, yeah. So his clear style made German philosophy seem accessible, but the intro warns He's not a trustworthy guide to others.
It even quotes him saying, go to the originals, don't rely on the cast of a cast.
Hmm.
Good advice. So knowing Kant helps you understand Schopenhauer. Maybe you see where he deviates. And knowing Hegel provides a kind of counterweight to Schopenhauer's one-sidedness.
That's the suggestion. Hegel offered a different perspective, and the intro even lists some English thinkers influenced by Hegel, showing that alternative was active too.
Okay, so influences personality. Leads to contradictions in his work. The intro seems to say that's almost expected.
Yeah, it ties it back to his view of the universe itself being a mighty contradiction. So maybe his philosophy reflecting that isn't surprising.
And his main concept, the will. It's not simple, is it? The intro warns against just plugging in our usual idea of will.
Yeah.
It says his concept ranges from something quite basic, almost material, up to something much more idealistic.
Exactly. It's slippery. And he makes contradictory sounding statements too, like, we need metaphysics, but all metaphysics is kind of foolish.
Huh. Or arguing for speculation that leads to action, wisdom for living. But then excusing philosophers from being saints. Using an analogy about sculptors not having to be beautiful themselves.
Right. There's often a gap between his theory and his own practice, or at least his perceived personality, like discovering the root of morality and this deep sympathy, this unity of all beings.
But then being known as quite misanthropic himself, lacking that sympathy.
Precisely. Or advocating giving up the joys of life, renouncing the will to live, but arguing against suicide. It's complex.
But the intro insists there's real value there, despite the knots. Like, his push for everyone to figure out their own theory of life, not just inherit one, that feels important.
Very. And his take on history, not just listing facts, but looking for the deeper meaning, the underlying patterns.
So maybe he's better at framing the big problems than offering neat solutions, pointing to will as the ultimate reality, sympathy as the ethical core.
And leaving the puzzle of how to reconcile those in a way that affirms life rather than negates it for others to solve.
Yeah.
That seems to be the takeaway.
Even his pessimism, which can be, well, pretty heavy. The intro suggests as a philosophical value. Maybe it's more honest than systems that try too hard to be optimistic. Forces a rethink of basic assumptions.
That's the argument presented. That his gloomy consistency might actually be a strength, a truer insight, compared to, say, Locke or Mill, who he might see as glossing over the difficulties. It's a challenge to easy optimism.
And finally, this idea of him being in revolt against pretty much every orthodox position, a protest philosophy.
Yeah, which naturally attracts people who are also dissatisfied, right? But the intro cleverly suggests that if you agree with his criticisms of others, maybe you should also consider the criticisms against him.
Leading to potentially new insights, like combining his view and his opponent's views, getting a more rounded picture, a stereoscopic combination.
Exactly. That friction could be productive. Yeah. So the conclusion is, despite all the flaws and contradictions, Schopenhauer is incredibly stimulating. A mind is suggestion.
For both literary and philosophical types, if you try to understand why he was so wayward, extend a bit of empathy. There's a lot to gain.
So wrapping up this look at the introduction, Schopenhauer emerges as this fascinatingly contradictory figure. He blends influences into something utterly his own. He's critical, yet driven by belief. His personality is inseparable from his work. And despite all the tangles, he really makes you think.
Yeah, this intro definitely gives you a solid, quick grasp of his persona and initial impact. It really primes you for diving deeper into his actual writings.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves us with a thought for you, the listener. How much does knowing about a thinker's life, their personality, their biases affect how you read their ideas? And maybe, just maybe, are those contradictions, those messy parts, actually the most interesting places, the spots where new understanding can really grow, something to ponder? What part of Schopenhauer's character or philosophy grabs you the most or seems the most paradoxical, and what might that tell you?